So, Lucas, I'd like to start with you. We know from scientific research that climate change is the biggest crisis of our lifetimes. But in the middle of a pandemic and economic recession, that may be hard for some people to really think about. So, to put our discussion in context, how do you think, or why do you think it's important to keep a laser focus on climate change in the middle of everything else that's going on right now?
Well, at Microsoft, we talk about, kind of COVID as the crisis of the year and climate of the crisis as the crisis of the decade and beyond. So I think that's a really good framing. We are going to get through the COVID crisis that we're experiencing as a global species. And when we do, we have a much bigger, quite frankly, crisis ahead of us, which is trying to ensure the stabilization of our global climate systems. We've simply got to do that if we want to continue to improve the global human experience. There's just no question about it.
Jerry, turning to you, COVID-19 could take our collective eyes off of climate change. There's only so much bandwidth, and UN leaders have already expressed some concerns about regression and a lack of resources to tackle the climate crisis caused by the expense of coping with COVID-19. So I understand you're still optimistic. Why is that?
Well, first of all, I have 2 teenage children, so there's not much of a choice but to be an optimist about finding solutions on climate change. But there's a lot of evidence in our recent experience that we've scaled up solutions to the climate problem much more quickly than we have other structural problems in the past. Let's face it, this has really only been a mainstream global topic of geopolitical conversation since around 2007. The release of An Inconvenient Truth put this on the radar screens of publics around the world. And in that short period of time, we've made an enormous amount of progress. We could cite a lot of statistics, but my favorite is the decline and collapse of coal as a long-term viable source of electricity generation. In the United States alone, in 2010, coal made up about half, a little more than half of America's electricity generation. And here we are 10 years later, and it's less than 20%. So the evidence that we should, I guess the source of hope that we should take from what's happened so far since we've become apprised and seized with climate as a major crisis of our own making is that unlike what you read in the doomsday scenarios popular in the press, we've actually solved a lot of big problems, and we've invested in the technological innovations that will solve the remaining ones.
Lucas, we have a lot to talk about when it comes to solutions. There is still a lot to do, taking Jerry's point, but there's still more to do. And so this goal of net zero carbon emissions has become kind of a rallying cry for that. We're seeing prominent multinational corporations and a growing number of countries committing to such a target. Can you briefly describe the term net zero? What does that mean for anyone who may not know? And then tell us about what some companies like yours, Microsoft, are doing to meet it.
Well, net zero is super, super easy to describe. It simply means that we are removing more carbon from the atmosphere, removing as much carbon from the atmosphere as we're putting in. So that's extremely simple to say. It's just a balancing of our carbon books. It's really difficult to actually do, though. And the reason for that is there's basically 2 levers that you have at your disposal. You can reduce carbon emissions, and that's one way to balance out your books. You could reduce carbon emissions to 0. We have not figured out any way to grow our economy without growing our carbon emissions to date. If we look back at the past 50 years, you see economic growth, you see an incredibly strong correlation with growth in carbon emissions as well. You could look at the other side and you could look at the removal side, and you could say, well, we could just continue unmitigated emissions and remove the carbon that we emit. And we have figured out technology solutions for how to do that, but not at a scale that makes this work kind of at the global scale that we need or the economic scale that we need. And so when you think about net zero and the global need for our global economy to move to a net zero carbon economy by 2050, it's clear that we're going to have to do both. We're going to have to reduce carbon emissions as much as possible, and we're going to have to remove the rest, and we're going to have to invest in solutions in both areas. Now, for us as a global society to get there, as a global economy, I believe that those organizations that have more right now should do more right now in order for us to get there and make it easier for everybody else. So back in January of this year, Microsoft committed to actually being carbon negative, to reducing our emissions by half or more, removing the rest, and then going beyond that to remove all of the historical emissions that Microsoft has been responsible for since we were founded in 1975, and to invest $1 billion through a new climate and innovation fund in carbon reduction and removal technologies. Because there's one thing that I would just add on top of that, those that have more should do more. It's that those that have more should do more, and they should do it in a way that enables and empowers others to follow in their footsteps with less cost and with less effort. Because that's what we need to do. We need to plow a road that makes it easy for everybody to travel down towards 2050 on a net zero carbon path.